Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I've been continuing to ask hard questions throughout the pandemic, largely because it is important to be open, transparent, and to not hide by questions that appear to be inconvenient. One of the questions that seems to never go away is this question about cancer. And people have been talking about turbo cancer, which has consistently been denied by those in high realms of the scientific community. It's just a made up story. Cancer rates are not actually increasing, they're about the same as ever. But guess what? Coincidentally, in just the past few days, there is evidence that infection, SARS-CoV-2 infection, heightens the risk of developing HPV related cancer. Now, the first question you must ask yourself if you're a thinking person is if there is no concern, if everything is okay, why are they looking for the risk associated with infection? Because you would expect if things are stable, don't worry too much about it. But it is clearly, firstly, an acknowledgement that there is a problem and that behind the scenes, people are observing things that they know need to be investigated. So the strategy is look for anything else but and everybody can say it together. So you look around and you try and find other causes. This is very similar to what happened in the 50s and 60s into the 70s after there was what appeared to be a clear epidemiological link between smoking and cancer. Well, there was an association, but the smoking lobby kept on saying, show us the evidence that this is the cause. And they managed to evade this question for almost 30 years until it became so blatantly obvious that there was a connection that they could no longer deny it. We don't want a similar thing to happen here. So let's look at what they did in this study. It was a big study. That's the first thing that you have to acknowledge. And so when you look at this here, this study was looking at the impact of SARS-CoV-2 infection on HPV related cancer. Now, the first question is why HPV? Well, I think they were looking at a specific viral infection that they knew had a very strong association with cancer. And so that made sense. Let's look at a viral infection or a situation where there is already a strong association with cancer and see whether or not there is a change in relation to COVID infection. And as you can see here, they looked at 106 healthcare organizations spanning 15 countries. The authors were from Taiwan, about 124 million participants. That's what they used. And then they dissected it down to only include about 4.8 million patients. And of that, 1.2 had infection. And so they were able to compare the infection versus the non infection group over a 3 year period. And they found a 67% increase in cervical cancer, 131% in vaginal cancer, 98% in vulva cancer. So this was indicating that there is a strong association between infection and the risk of cancer. So here is my thought. Anytime I see a study like this and I don't know, or they haven't specifically included in their analysis a link or a reference to what the vaccination status was, COVID vaccination status was of the people who got cancer, I, my personal opinion is that's muddying the waters. The question is it deliberate or did they just not think about it? Maybe they don't know the questions. Maybe they don't understand that people are asking this question. And so therefore they will just get on with looking for everything else because as far as they are concerned, it is not possible that there could be an association between cancer and the COVID vaccine. It's not possible. And so, therefore, what is the point of looking for it? We must look for everything else: infection, whether or not people were in a car accident, anything but that vaccine. And that makes perfect sense. Now, when I call it out, because it is very clear that if they wanted to, they could. Because look at this in the paper. In the paper here, the eligible participants between 18 and 90 years old having a prior SARS-CoV-2 infection before 2020, okay, in 2020, not 2021. So it must be before. They didn't have HPV vaccines, and they must not have received any SARS-CoV-2 vaccines between January 2020 and December 31st, 2020. So what that indicates is that they were excluding people who had been vaccinated between January to December 2020. So it means you have the vaccination status. It means you can conclusively know who got a vaccine and who didn't. So this is the point I'm making, is that clearly they just don't want to look at it, or it doesn't make any sense. It's illogical. It doesn't make any scientific sense. And so they then broke that down, that analysis down, looking for the increased risk of cancer. And what I said before, they found a significantly increased risk in people who had SARS-CoV-2 infection over a 3-year period of time, infection in 2020, they had a higher risk of cancer. So me being simple-minded, I mean, I'm not a statistician. I'm just a doctor. I just see patients and look for connections between diseases. My simple question is this: in the cohort that you looked at with an increased risk of cancer, were they all unvaccinated, COVID unvaccinated? So remember, we don't have any data beyond 2021. So my question would be, well, you know, do you know the vaccination status of the people beyond 2021? Is it possible? Is it possible that that could be relevant in the context of increased cancer risk? Now, in order to understand why I'm asking that question, we have to go and look back at why they were looking and what their explanation was for this unusual pattern. And so, here in the paper, what they said is that it is noteworthy that they found that a patient's rapid progression from cervical dysplasia to invasive cervical carcinoma within just 7 months, with a documented infection occurring 3 months prior to the development of this cancer. So the hypothesis suggests that the immune system may become preoccupied and depleted by the concurrent presence of SARS-CoV-2, potentially reducing immunological pressure on the HPV infected cervical dysplasia, hastening disease progression. Essentially, the infection is taking advantage of the immune system, occupying it so much that it can't fight off other cancers. That makes sense. Okay. And to me, I would say something like even interferon, meaning that if you have the immune system overactive with interferon or suppressed by interferon from infection, it could increase the risk of cancer. The question is, could you apply that same logic to the vaccine? That's the question. Because it's not a direct effect, it's an indirect effect, which is what I have been saying from the start. It's not that COVID vaccines deliberately cause cancer. No, I think when I looked at the analysis, and you can look in the description for the work that I did, I put together a course almost 2 years ago, looking at all the mechanisms that are related to the fact that it can increase the risk in someone who already has a risk. And that was the point by doing these exact things. Additionally, here's the important point: if vaccines, COVID vaccines, prevented infection, that would be another important point, because then you would have vaccinated someone, and therefore, because they can't get an infection, their risk is lower. But here's what the real world and science is telling us: the higher the number of vaccines, the higher the IgG4, the higher the risk of infection. So, in fact, the increased risk of infection in the vaccinated, if the problem is just COVID infection, should mean that the cohort who is highest affected, based on their own analysis, should therefore be the vaccinated cohort, even if you take out any potential risk directly from the vaccine. It's just that nobody wants to look at it. They're going to leave it for another 5 years, 10 years. When, if we see in the future a huge upsurge in cancer, what we're seeing now, and it's important to understand, it is not that people argue whether or not cancer cases has significantly increased. And I think that there is some evidence. When I looked at it in 2023, and it's in the presentation, there was a clear increase in new diagnosis. But it's not just about the diagnosis of cancer. What is happening is that we are seeing late stage presentation of cancer as the first point of presentation. That's a completely different ball game. So even if you had the same number of people getting cancer, if they present late, your ability to intervene is very low. Not zero, but very low. And so when we think about that, that is one of the biggest parts of the problems. The cancer normally goes through stages: stage one, stage two, stage three, stage four. Stage four meaning metastatic spread. Stage one, it's a certain size. Stage two, it's bigger and infiltrating the tissue. Stage three, it's spreading into the lymph nodes. And stage four, it's spread to distant organs. What happens if a cancer that would normally be at stage one or stage two also has spread to distant organs? That's the problem. And so we are seeing a change in the way how cancer is presenting. And the question is why? And if they don't start looking specifically at the links, so meaning that they had the chance to do that, they looked at so many people. When you look at the breakdown as to what they did, it's incredible the numbers that they had access to. This is 117 million people in this network. 52 million were female, never received a HPV vaccine before 2020, was still 52 million. No HPV-related cancer before, that was 6 million. No COVID vaccine injections up to 2020. This was still 1.2 million. Well, 4.8 million. Infection 3.5. This could easily have been broken out into slightly other groups: COVID vaccinated, 2 doses, booster doses, and you then look to see whether or not the combination of infection and subsequent vaccination, because remember, this cohort already had natural immunity. What percentage of this cohort was then vaccinated? And if they were, did they have higher or lower risk of cancer? Now, if they just did that, can you imagine how they'd be able to shut else up if they said, look, we have done that, we've broken it out, there is actually great cancer protection for those who've been vaccinated? That would have been a great story to sell. That would strengthen their narrative, which is crumbling at the moment. But no, they haven't done it. They won't do it. Is it that they actually know? I can't believe that. I can't believe the scientific community would do what the smoking lobby did in the between the 50s and the 80s, where they deliberately muddied the waters. They deliberately concealed evidence of cancer. They deliberately did stuff so that they could continue to market their products. I would hate to believe that when we look at history, it is then found that this was not looked at deliberately. I would rather to think that the research community and the scientific community are just they're just locked in a narrative. They just can't get their heads around it. They have cognitive dissonance. I'd even prefer to call them a little bit silly, but not deliberately not looking at this. That would be my biggest concern, my biggest fear if we were to find in the future. Let's hope not. But I will not stop poking this bear until when they do these studies, anyone that hasn't included vaccination status, I'll call them out. They may not like it, but it is what we have to do. Remember to look in the description and follow us for more information. Like, subscribe, and comment. It helps the algorithm. Have a great evening.